So we have talked about delivery. When does delivery occur? We've talked about conformity. How do we know that the goods conform to the terms of the contract? And finally, that brings us to payment. Payment is pretty straightforward. The buyer's obligation is to pay against delivery. Once the goods have been delivered, the buyer must pay the price. And the buyer must do so without the need for a request or an invoice or special forms. The buyer has an obligation to pay the price once the goods are received. And failing to pay the price is a breach of the contract. The buyer did not perform according to the terms of the contract. Now, if it's an installment contract in which payments are going to be made over time, failing to make a payment is failure of the obligation to pay the price, meaning you have now breached the contract, even though there may be other payments left remaining that you haven't, that the time has not come for. Failing to make an installment payment is failure of the obligation to pay the price. Now, if the time for payment is not set out in the contract, and ordinarily we would expect to see that in a contract, but if it's not, the buyer must pay the seller when the seller tenders the goods to the buyer, meaning places the goods at the buyer's disposal. All right, let's talk a little bit more about breach of contract. Now, we said the third thing that a contracting system must do is to provide for remedies for the breach of the contract. And the CISG does so. However, the proper remedy to be used is going to depend on the type of breach. Now, breach of a contract, again, refers to a party's failure to perform an obligation under the contract. Now, there are two types of breach. The first is fundamental breach. In the UCC, we refer to this as material breach. And the second type of breach is a breach less than fundamental, or what we call simple breach. Two different types of breach. Let's start with fundamental breach or material breach. A breach of contract is fundamental if it causes such detriment to the other party as to deprive the non-breaching party of what it expected to receive under the contract, meaning it completely destroyed the non-breaching party their contractual intent. They did not get what they bargained for in the contract. Now, fundamental breach is something, again, the parties can agree to in the contract. If they do not, then for our purposes, a seller is going to commit fundamental breach if it fails to ship the goods. So a failure to ship is a fundamental breach. You fail to provide the goods as called for in the contract. A buyer commits fundamental breach if it fails to pay the price, if it does not pay the entire amount of the obligation it took on in the contract. So for our purposes, fundamental breach for a seller, failure to ship. Fundamental breach for a buyer is failure to pay. And that's what we'll refer to on your exam. And again, the contract itself can establish what is a fundamental breach so that we don't have to go through this determination of whether a party was substantially deprived of their contractual expectation. Now, the second type of breach is what we call less than fundamental breach in the CISG. We have the same concept in the UCC, which is called simple breach. And the best way to think about the difference between fundamental breach and simple breach would be something along the lines of, well, in a services contract, if I hired you to build me a house and we set out certain specifications, and including what color the walls would be painted in each room, and we agree to that contract, and you as the provider of the service, you fail to build me the house, or maybe you clear the lot but then never actually start construction on the house. Well, that's a fundamental breach, and that gives me the right to walk away from the contract or to sue for the full contract amount. If instead the provider provides the house and the house meets most of the specifications, but one room is painted the wrong color, then that would be a simple breach. A breach of one aspect of the performance, but that aspect of the performance did not substantially deprive you of what you're expected to receive under the thing. So again, from a seller's perspective, a seller commits simple breach. I'm sorry, this is incorrect. A seller commits simple breach if it ships the goods late. A buyer commits simple breach if it pays the price late. So for our purposes, disregard what's on the screen. For our purposes, a seller who ships late has committed a simple breach, a less than fundamental breach. A buyer who pays late or pays a portion then also commits a simple breach.